The crystal tumbler caught the amber light of the chandelier above, its contents swirling like liquid gold against the pristine white tablecloth. Marcus Blackwood lifted the glass toward his lips, the familiar burn of 18-year-old scotch already anticipated on his tongue when a whisper cut through the low murmur of the restaurant's evening crowd. "Don't drink that." The words were barely audible, spoken so quietly they might have been mistaken for the rustle of silk or the gentle clink of silverware. Marcus paused, the glass hovering inches from his mouth, his steel-gray eyes shifting to find their source. Standing beside his table, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly as she adjusted the white linen napkin beside his plate, was a young woman he'd never noticed before. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair pulled back in the regulation ponytail required by Chez Laurent's strict dress code. Her name tag read Elena, and beneath the professional smile she wore like armor, Marcus glimpsed something that made his chest tighten. Fear so pure and desperate, it seemed to radiate from her like heat from a flame. The restaurant buzzed around them, oblivious to the moment suspended between patron and server. At the table nearest the window, Judge Harrison Caldwell regaled his companions with stories from the bench, his booming laugh punctuating the gentle classical music that floated through the dining room. Near the bar, Senator Patricia Voss nursed her usual martini, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent decades reading faces and calculating votes. The city's elite moved through their evening rituals, secure in their bubbles of wealth and influence, unaware that death might be as close as the bottom of a glass. Elena's fingers worked methodically, straightening silverware that didn't need straightening, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. She had been working at Chez Laurent for 3 months now, ever since she'd arrived in the city with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a determination to disappear into anonymity. The job wasn't glamorous, minimum wage plus tips, split shifts that left her exhausted, feet aching from hours spent navigating the maze of tables filled with people who looked through her as if she were invisible. But it was honest work, and honesty had become a luxury she couldn't afford to lose. Marcus set the glass down carefully, his businessman's instincts screaming warnings. He'd built his empire on reading people, on sensing opportunity and danger in equal measure, and right now, every fiber of his being told him to listen to this girl whose name he didn't know, but whose eyes held secrets that could reshape everything he thought he understood about his carefully ordered world. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice low enough that the nearby tables couldn't overhear. Elena's professional mask slipped for just an instant, revealing the frightened young woman beneath. I noticed something unusual about your drink, sir. Perhaps I could bring you a fresh one from the bar." She was lying, and they both knew it, but something in her tone, in the way her dark eyes darted toward the kitchen doors and back to his face, told Marcus that this lie might be the most truthful thing anyone had said to him in years. The scotch sat untouched, its surface still and golden under the restaurant's warm lighting. He'd ordered it the same way he always did when he dined at Chez Laurent. Neat, no ice, the finest 18 single malt they carried. It was a ritual as familiar as breathing, part of the carefully orchestrated routine that defined his evenings when business brought him to the city's most exclusive dining establishment. But tonight felt different. Tonight the familiar weight of his Armani jacket seemed heavier on his shoulders, and the conversations flowing around him carried an undercurrent of tension he couldn't quite identify. He'd noticed it the moment he'd walked through the restaurant's mahogany doors. The way conversations paused when he passed, the furtive glances that followed his progress to his usual table by the window overlooking the city's glittering skyline. Elena moved with practiced efficiency, her presence both unobtrusive and oddly comforting. She poured water into his crystal glass, her movement steady despite whatever internal storm was raging behind those dark eyes. The restaurant's other servers glided between tables with the same professional grace, But there was something different about Elena, a quality of alertness that reminded Marcus of a deer sensing danger in familiar territory. "The special tonight is pan-seared halibut with lemon herb butter," she said, her voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone who'd repeated the same words dozens of times. "Chef Martineau recommends it with the Sancerre." Marcus nodded absently, his attention fixed not on the menu, but on the way Elena's hands had stilled when she'd spoken about his drink. He'd spent 30 years building Blackwood Industries from a single contract onto a billion-dollar empire, and success at that level required an almost supernatural ability to read people. Right now, everything about Elena's body language screamed that she was terrified of something, and that something was directly connected to the glass of scotch sitting untouched between them. The restaurant's ambiance wrapped around them like expensive silk, soft lighting that flattered even the harshest features, the gentle murmur of conversation punctuated by the discreet clink of fine china and crystal. Chez Laurent had been Marcus's sanctuary for nearly a decade, a place where he could conduct business away from the glass towers of downtown, where million-dollar deals were sealed over perfectly prepared meals and aged wine that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a month. But sanctuaries, Marcus had learned long ago, could become traps with frightening speed. He studied Elena's face as she waited for his order, noting the way her pupils seemed slightly dilated, the faint sheen of perspiration at her hairline despite the restaurant's perfectly controlled temperature. She was beautiful in an understated way that the city's elite would overlook. No designer clothes or professionally applied makeup, just the kind of natural grace that suggested small-town origins and honest work. "Have we met before?" he asked quietly. Elena's response came too quickly. "No, sir, I would remember." Another lie, but this one carried a different weight. Marcus felt the familiar tingle of intuition that had served him so well in business, the sense that he stood at the edge of something vast and potentially dangerous, something that would require every ounce of the cunning and courage that had carried him from poverty to power. The scotch continued to sit untouched, its amber depths reflecting the restaurant's warm light like a pool of liquid fire. Somewhere in the kitchen, he could hear the controlled chaos of dinner service, the rapid-fire commands of Chef Martineau, the clatter of pans and dishes, the organized symphony that created the meals that graced tables throughout the dining room. The sounds were familiar and comforting, part of the restaurant's character that had drawn him back week after week for years. Yet tonight, even those familiar sounds carried an edge of menace. He made his decision with the same swift certainty that had characterized every major choice of his adult life. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, sliding it across the white tablecloth until it rested beside Elena's trembling fingers. "If you need help, call me, day or night." Elena's eyes widened as she read the simple black text. Marcus Blackwood, Chairman and CEO, Blackwood Industries. Below it, a phone number that connected directly to his personal line, a number known to fewer than a dozen people in the world. "I don't understand," she whispered. "You saved my life tonight," Marcus replied, pushing the glass of scotch away with deliberate finality. "I don't know how or why, but I'm certain of it. That makes us connected in ways neither of us probably understands yet."
"Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Blackwood?" The man's French accent was perfectly cultivated, his smile warm, but somehow failing to reach his eyes. "Perfect as always, Henri," Marcus replied smoothly. "Though I think I'll skip the scotch tonight. Elena here convinced me to try something new." Henri's gaze shifted to Elena, and for just an instant, Marcus caught something that made his blood run cold. A flash of anger so pure and venomous that it transformed the man's carefully maintained facade into something almost reptilian. "Of course, sir. Elena is new to our staff. I hope she's providing adequate service." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in the silk of professional courtesy but sharp as a blade underneath. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge, the same fierce loyalty that had driven him to shield his employees from hostile takeovers and corporate raiders. "She's exceptional," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'll be requesting her specifically from now on." Henri's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Wonderful. I'll make note of that in our reservation system." As the maitre d' glided away, Marcus caught Elena's eye one final time. The gratitude there was almost overwhelming in its intensity, but beneath it lay something else, a story of pain and danger that he suddenly, desperately wanted to understand. The untouched glass of scotch sat between them like a question mark, its contents now seeming less like liquid gold and more like liquid shadow, dark with possibilities that Marcus was only beginning to comprehend. Elena Martinez had learned to make herself invisible long before she'd ever set foot in Chez Laurent. It was a skill born of necessity, honed through years of practice in places where being noticed meant being hurt. As she moved through the restaurant's dining room, refilling water glasses and adjusting place settings with mechanical precision, she carried that invisibility like a protective cloak, letting the wealthy patron's conversations flow around her as if she were nothing more than part of the furniture. But invisibility came with a price. It meant swallowing words when customers snapped their fingers at her like she was a trained dog. It meant smiling when Senator Voss made cutting remarks about the help loud enough for everyone to hear. It meant pretending she didn't see the way some of the male patrons' eyes followed her movements, their gazes lingering in ways that made her skin crawl and her hands shake as she poured their wine. Her apartment was a studio on the wrong side of downtown, 12 floors up in a building where the elevator worked maybe half the time, and the walls were so thin she could hear her neighbor's television through the night. The rent ate up most of her paycheck, leaving her with enough for groceries and not much else. She'd furnished the place with items from thrift stores and sidewalk finds, a mismatched chair, a table that wobbled, a bed frame she'd assembled herself with tools borrowed from the building's maintenance man. But it was hers, and that mattered more than comfort or beauty. For the first time in 3 years, she had a place where no one could find her, where she could lock the door and know that whatever waited on the other side would stay there until she decided to face it. The morning after her encounter with Marcus Blackwood, Elena stood at her single window, looking out over the city's sprawling landscape as she sipped coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. The business card sat on her small table, its crisp white surface somehow managing to dominate the entire space despite its modest size. She stared at it for hours the night before, turning it over in her hands like a talisman, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake or if she'd finally found someone who might actually help her. 3 years ago, Elena Martinez had been Elena Vasquez, married to Detective Tommy Vasquez of the Metro Police Department's Narcotics Division. They'd lived in a neat suburban house with a garden she'd tended lovingly, growing tomatoes and herbs that she'd used in the elaborate meals that she'd prepared for Tommy and his partner whenever they'd worked late cases. She'd been working toward her nursing degree, volunteering at the free clinic on weekends, planning for the children she and Tommy had talked about having once his promotion came through. The memory of that life felt like something that had happened to someone else, viewed through glass that distorted everything into shapes she could barely recognize.
Tommy had been a good cop. Everyone said so. Honest, dedicated, the kind of officer who still believed the system could work if good people were willing to fight for it. When he'd started asking questions about discrepancies in evidence logs, about cases that seemed to disappear from the system, about arrests that somehow never made it to court, Elena had supported him completely. She had encouraged him to keep digging, to trust his instincts, to do what he'd always done, follow the truth wherever it led. She'd had no idea that the truth would lead to a bullet in the back of his head and a cover-up so complete that the official report blamed his death on a drug dealer who'd been in county lockup the night Tommy died. The grief had nearly destroyed her, but it was the fear that had forced her to run. Because Tommy had talked to her about everything, had shared his suspicions and his evidence, had trusted his wife with the information that had gotten him killed. The people responsible knew that Elena knew, and they'd made it clear that Tommy's death was just the beginning of what they were willing to do to keep their secrets buried. She'd left town 3 days after the funeral, taking only what she could fit in a single bag and the small amount of cash she'd been able to withdraw without triggering attention. She'd driven west, trading her car for another in a truck stop outside Phoenix, then north to Portland, then east to Denver, creating a trail so tangled that even she sometimes forgot which identity she was supposed to be living under. Elena Martinez was her third name in 3 years. She had the documents to prove it, purchased with money she'd earned working cash jobs in places where no one asked too many questions. The woman who'd made those documents had been professional and discreet, but she'd also been clear about their limitations. "These'll get you by," she'd said, sliding the driver's license and social security card across the table in the back room of a print shop that smelled of ink and industrial solvent. "But don't push them too hard. Get a job, keep your head down, and pray nobody looks too close." Elena had followed that advice religiously for 3 years, working as a house cleaner, a grocery store clerk, a dog walker, any job that paid cash and didn't require references. She'd moved every 6 months, never staying long enough to form real relationships, never allowing herself to trust anyone enough to share her real story. Until last night, when she'd looked into Marcus Blackwood's eyes and seen something she'd almost forgotten existed, genuine concern for another human being. The decision to warn him had been purely instinctual. She'd been refilling water glasses in the section near the bar when she'd overheard the conversation between Aubrey and someone she'd never seen before, a man in an expensive suit who'd spoken in the kind of quiet, controlled voice that somehow carried more menace than shouting ever could. "The scotch for table 12, the stranger had said. "Make sure it's the 18 year. "Of course," Henri had replied. "Though I should mention, Mr. Blackwood has been asking questions lately about some of our other patrons, their business dealings. Perhaps it would be wise to just make sure he gets the right drink. Everything else will take care of itself." Elena had continued her work, moving between tables with practiced efficiency while her mind raced. She'd heard enough conversations like that in Tommy's world to recognize the coded language of people who solve problems with violence. But she'd also learned that the safest thing to do was to mind her own business, to see nothing and remember less. She might have done exactly that if Marcus Blackwood hadn't reminded her so much of Tommy. Not in appearance. Marcus was older, silver-haired where Tommy had been dark, polished where her husband had been rough around the edges, but something in the way he carried himself, in the kindness he showed to service staff when he thought no one was watching, in the way he looked at her when she'd approached his table, not through her as most customers did, but at her, as if she were a real person whose words mattered. Tommy had looked at people that way. It's what made him a good cop, and ultimately what got him killed. Now, standing in her tiny apartment with Marcus's business card in her hand, Elena faced the same choice that had been haunting her for 3 years. Stay invisible and safe, or risk everything to do what was right. Her phone buzzed, startling her from her reverie. The text message was from an unknown number, but its content made her blood run cold. "We know where you work now."
Elena's hand shook as she read the message again, her carefully constructed new life suddenly feeling as fragile as tissue paper. They'd found her again, just as they'd found her in Phoenix and Portland and Denver. The miracle wasn't that it had happened, it was that it had taken them this long. But this time was different. This time she wasn't running alone into the darkness with nothing but fear for company. This time she had a business card with a name and a phone number, and the memory of a man who looked at her like she mattered. Elena moved quickly, throwing her few possessions into the same worn duffel bag that had carried her across half the country. But instead of heading for the bus station or the airport, instead of choosing a new city and a new identity, she made a different choice. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on Marcus Blackwood's card. It rang once before a familiar voice answered. "Marcus Blackwood?" "Mr. Blackwood?" Elena said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "This is Elena from the restaurant.
I think I need that help you offered." There was a pause, and then, "Where are you?" "My apartment. But I don't think I can stay here much longer." "Give me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Elena rattled off the information, then added, "Mr. Blackwood, when you come, you should probably know that my real name isn't Elena Martinez, and the people who want to hurt you, they're the same ones who killed my husband." Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried a weight of understanding that made Elena's chest tight with something she'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. "Then we have a lot to talk about," he said. "But first, let's get you somewhere safe." As Elena hung up the phone, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror beside her door. The frightened, hollow-eyed woman who'd been running for 3 years looked back at her, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, that woman wasn't alone. The duffel bag sat by the door, ready for another flight to another anonymous city. But instead now sat Marcus Blackwood's business card, and with it, the possibility that running might finally be coming to an end. Elena thought of Tommy, of the way he'd believed that good people could make a difference if they were brave enough to try. She thought of the untouched glass of scotch sitting on table 12 and the conversation she'd overheard that had probably saved a man's life. Maybe invisibility wasn't the only form of protection available to her. Maybe, sometimes, the safest thing to do was step out of the shadows and trust that someone would be there to catch you when you fell. Outside her window, the city sprawled endlessly in all directions, full of hiding places and escape routes and new identities waiting to be claimed. But for the first time in 3 years, Elena Martinez, whoever she really was, wasn't planning to use any of them.
Marcus arrived at Elena's building in a black sedan with tinted windows, accompanied by 2 men whose alert postures and subtle earpieces marked them as professional security. The building's lobby smelled of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that made everyone look like they were recovering from a long illness. When Elena appeared in the doorway with her duffel bag, Marcus was struck again by how young she looked and how the fear in her eyes was matched by an equal measure of determination. "This is James and Parker," he said, indicating his companions. "They work for a company that specializes in keeping people alive when other people would prefer they weren't." Elena nodded to both men, noting the way they positioned themselves to watch both the street and the building's entrance simultaneously. "Thank you for coming." "Before we go anywhere," Marcus said, "I need to know exactly what we're dealing with. You said people killed your husband, the same people who wanted to poison me." Elena glanced around the lobby, where a few residents moved through their evening routines with a practiced indifference of people who'd learned not to see or hear anything that might complicate their lives. "Not here," she said. "Too many ears." Marcus nodded and gestured toward the sedan. "My office, then. It's secure." The drive through the city's evening traffic gave Elena time to organize her thoughts, to decide how much truth she could afford to share with a man she barely knew but was already trusting with her life. Through the sedan's tinted windows, the familiar streets took on a different quality, less like the maze she'd learned to navigate, and more like a battlefield where unseen enemies moved through familiar territory. Marcus's office occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower that reflected the city's lights like a crystal prism. The elevator rose smoothly through floors of darkened offices until it opened onto a reception area that managed to be both luxurious and surprisingly comfortable. Elena had expected corporate intimidation, the kind of aggressive wealth display that some successful men used as armor. Instead, she found herself in a space that felt more like an upscale home than a business headquarters. "Coffee?" Marcus asked, leading her into a conference room whose floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. "Or something stronger." "Coffee would be good," Elena replied, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than she'd earned in the past month. James and Parker took positions near the door and window respectively, their presence somehow both reassuring and ominous. Elena had the sense that violence, while not imminent, was certainly among the options being considered. Marcus poured coffee from a service set that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel, then settled into the chair across from her. "Talk to me," he said simply. Elena wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic mug and began to speak. She told him about Tommy, about their life together, about the investigation that had started with routine questions about missing evidence and had escalated into something that had ultimately cost her husband his life. She described the phone calls that had started 3 days after the funeral. Calm, professional voices explaining that certain information needed to remain buried and that people who insisted on digging up the past might find themselves sharing that past's fate. "I ran," she said, her voice steady despite the memories she was reliving. "Changed my name, changed my appearance, moved every few months. I got pretty good at being nobody." "But they found you anyway," Marcus said. Elena nodded. "They always do, eventually. I think they use me as a kind of test, see how good their people are at tracking someone who doesn't want to be found. Every year or so, I get a reminder that they know where I am, and then I move again."
Marcus leaned back in his chair, his businessman's mind processing the implications. "You said the people who killed your husband are connected to whoever wanted to poison me. How do you know that?" Elena described the conversation she'd overheard between Henri and the well-dressed stranger, the coded language that had triggered memories of similar conversations from Tommy's investigation. "Your husband's case," Marcus said. "What was he investigating specifically?" Elena hesitated, then made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She reached into her duffel bag and withdrew a manila envelope that looked like it had been carried across the country multiple times. "Tommy made copies of everything," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. "Financial records, surveillance photos, witness statements. He was putting together a case against what he called the cleanup crew, people who made problems disappear for anyone with enough money to pay their fees." Marcus opened the envelope carefully, spreading the contents across the conference table. Bank statements, wire transfer records, photographs of meetings in parking garages and expensive restaurants, transcripts of phone conversations that had been recorded without warrants. The scope of the operation that emerged from the documents was breathtaking in its complexity and terrifying in its implications. "Jesus," he breathed, studying a photograph that showed Judge Harrison Caldwell shaking hands with a man whose face had been marked with a red X and the notation "Eliminated, 3/15/2022. Tommy was getting close, Elena continued. He'd identified the main players, traced some of their financial networks, even had a few low-level operatives who were willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Then one night he went to meet an informant, and the next morning they found him in an alley with a bullet in his head. Marcus studied the documents with the same intense focus he brought to complex business negotiations. Names jumped out at him. Political figures, business leaders, people he'd shared meals with at charity galas and industry conferences. The network Tommy had uncovered read like a who's who of the city's power structure. "Why didn't this come out after he died?" Marcus asked. "Because half the people who would have been responsible for investigating it are named in these files," Elena replied bitterly. "The other half were too scared to touch it. Tommy's captain buried the case file within a week of the funeral." Marcus found himself looking at a financial statement that showed regular payments to someone identified only as H. Dubois, payments that had originated from accounts connected to 3 of his biggest corporate rivals. "Henri," he said suddenly. Elena nodded, the maître d' at Chez Laurent. According to Tommy's notes, he's more than just a restaurant manager. He's a facilitator, someone who arranges meetings, passes messages, and occasionally handles more direct solutions to people's problems. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place in Marcus's mind. His presence at Chez Laurent hadn't been coincidental. He'd been deliberately drawn there by business associates who'd recommended the restaurant for discreet meetings. The guest list at any given evening included judges, politicians, corporate executives, and crime bosses all dining together in an atmosphere that suggested mutual respect and shared interests. "The scotch," he said. "What was in it?" I don't know specifically, Elena admitted, but based on what I overheard, it was meant to look like a heart attack or stroke, something that would seem natural for a man your age under stress.
Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest, not just at the attempt on his life, but at the casual way his murder had been planned and discussed. To the people behind this operation, he was nothing more than a problem to be solved, a name on a list to be crossed off. "Who ordered it?" he asked. Elena consulted Tommy's notes. Someone called the architect. Tommy never identified him, but based on the financial patterns, he's the one who coordinates everything. The murders, the cover-ups, the payments, everyone else is just following orders. James stepped forward from his position by the door. "Mr. Blackwood, if I may suggest, this is a police matter. We should contact the FBI." Elena laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The FBI? James, look at these names. Half of them are connected to federal agencies in some way. The other half have enough political influence to shut down any investigation before it starts." "Then what do you suggest?" Marcus asked. Elena met his gaze with an intensity that reminded him of steel being forged in fire. "We do what Tommy would have done. We keep digging until we find the truth, and then we make sure the whole world knows about it." Marcus studied the young woman across from him, seeing past the fear and exhaustion to the core of strength that had kept her alive for 3 years of running and hiding. She'd lost everything: her husband, her home, her identity, her sense of safety in the world. But she hadn't lost the thing that mattered most, her willingness to fight for what was right. "All right," he said, "but we're going to need help, the kind that comes with resources and expertise we don't have." He turned to Parker, who'd been studying the documents over his shoulder. "Call Michael Chen. Tell him I need to see him tonight and that it's a matter of life and death. Literally." Parker nodded and stepped away to make the call. Michael Chen was an investigative journalist who'd built his career exposing the kind of corruption that lived in the shadows of legitimate power. If anyone could help them navigate the dangerous waters they were about to enter, it would be Michael. Elena gathered the documents back into their envelope, her movements careful and precise. "There's something else you should know," she said. "According to Tommy's notes, the cleanup crew doesn't just eliminate problems, they eliminate everyone connected to those problems. Witnesses, family members, anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions later." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke. By helping Elena, by involving himself in her husband's investigation, Marcus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He was no longer just a potential victim. He was an active threat to people who solved threats with bullets and poison. "Well, I guess that settles it. We're in this together now, whether we like it or not." Elena smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and Marcus was struck by how the expression transformed her entire face. This was what she'd looked like before fear and grief had carved their marks into her features. Young and bright and full of the kind of hope that could move mountains. "Tommy would have liked you," she said softly. Outside the conference room's windows, the city continued its nightly rhythm, unaware that in a glass tower high above the streets, 2 people were making decisions that would either bring justice to those who thought themselves above the law or get them both killed in the attempt. Marcus looked out at the light spreading endlessly in all directions, each one representing a life, a story, a person who deserved to live in a world where wealth and power couldn't purchase the right to commit murder. Somewhere out there, the architect was probably planning his next move, calculating how to eliminate the threats that Marcus and Elena now represented. But for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Blackwood wasn't thinking like a businessman. He was thinking like a man who'd found something worth fighting for. Something more important than profit margins and quarterly reports, and the carefully managed expansion of his corporate empire. He was thinking like someone who'd finally found a cause worthy of the risks it would require. "James," he said, without turning from the window, I want you to contact our security division. Tell them I need a full threat assessment and protection detail, effective immediately." "For how many people, sir?" Marcus glanced at Elena, who was studying the documents spread across the table with the focused intensity of someone preparing for war. "All of us," he said. "This is going to get much worse before it gets better." As the evening deepened into night, more pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Michael Chen arrived within the hour, a slight man in his 40s, whose rumpled appearance and wire-rimmed glasses gave him the look of a professor rather than a journalist who'd spent his career exposing the darkest corners of institutional corruption. But the intelligence in his dark eyes and the way he immediately grasped the significance of Tommy's documents marked him as exactly the kind of ally they needed. "This is extraordinary work," Michael said, photographing each page with practiced efficiency. "Your husband was building a RICO case that would have taken down half the city's power structure." Elena nodded grimly. "He knew the risks. We both did. But we thought the system would protect good cops who were doing the right thing." "The system only works when the people running it wanted to work," Michael replied, studying a photograph of Senator Voss accepting what appeared to be a briefcase from an unidentified man in a parking garage. "When those same people are the ones committing the crimes, justice becomes a luxury they can't afford to allow." Marcus had been quiet for the past hour, absorbing the full scope of what they were facing. The cleanup crew that had killed Tommy wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a service industry that catered to the wealthy and powerful, providing solutions to problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. Need a witness to disappear? A journalist to stop investigating? A business rival to have an unfortunate accident? The crew provided all of these services with the kind of professional discretion that their clients demanded. "The question," Marcus said, finally, "is how we expose this without getting ourselves killed in the process." Michael looked up from the documents he'd been studying, carefully and with a lot of backup plans. He spread out a series of photographs showing various meetings and exchanges of money. "The beauty of your husband's investigation is that he didn't just collect evidence of crimes, he documented an entire business model. We can show how the crew operates, who their clients are, how they cover their tracks. That makes this more than just a murder case. It's a corruption story with national implications." Elena leaned forward. "But how do we get the story out without having it buried or discredited?" "Multiple channels, simultaneous release. Print, television, online platforms, social media. Make it impossible to suppress by making it too big to ignore." Marcus felt his strategic mind engaging with the problem. "We'll need more than just these documents. We need current evidence, proof that the operation is still active." "Which means going back into that restaurant," Elena said quietly. The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. Chez Laurent wasn't just where the attempt on Marcus's life had taken place. It was the operational center of the network they were trying to expose. Henri wasn't just a maitre d'. He was a coordinator who managed everything from contract killings to witness elimination. "Absolutely not," James said from his position by the door. "It's too dangerous." "James is right," Marcus agreed. "We need to find another way." Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. "There is no other way. Tommy spent 2 years trying to build this case from the outside, following financial trails and documenting meetings. It wasn't enough. The only way to get the evidence we need is to go to the source." She turned back to face the room, and Marcus was struck again by the transformation that came over her when she moved from fear into action. This was the woman who had risked everything to save a stranger's life, who had survived 3 years of running and hiding without losing her core sense of justice. "I can get back into the restaurant," she continued. "I still have my uniform, and Henri doesn't know that I warned you. As far as he's concerned, I'm just another frightened waitress who keeps her mouth shut and does her job." "Elena?" "No," Marcus said firmly. These people killed your husband. They won't hesitate to kill you." "They're going to kill me anyway," she replied matter-of-factly. "The only question is whether my death means something or whether it's just another name crossed off their list." Michael looked up from the photographs he'd been studying. "There might be a middle ground. Elena, how well do you know the restaurant's layout? The kitchen, the storage areas, the office spaces?" "Pretty well." "Why?" "Because we don't need you to confront Henri directly. We need you to plant surveillance equipment where it can record the conversations and transactions that prove this operation is still active." Marcus felt a surge of both admiration and terror at the elegance of the plan. It was exactly the kind of calculated risk that had built his business empire. But the stakes here were measured in lives rather than dollars. "The equipment exists," he said slowly. "My company has contracts with firms that specialize in corporate intelligence, devices small enough to hide anywhere, sophisticated enough to capture high-quality audio and video. And I know how to get them into the restaurant. There's a supply delivery every morning at 6 a.m. I've helped unload trucks before. It wouldn't be unusual for me to volunteer again." Parker stepped forward from his position by the window. "Even if we can get the devices in place, how do we ensure Elena's safety while she's planting them?" "We don't," Elena said simply. "This is war, and in war, soldiers take risks." Marcus stood and began pacing, his mind working through scenarios and contingencies. He'd built Blackwood Industries by taking calculated risks, but those risks had always been his own to take. The thought of sending Elena back into danger made something twist in his chest that felt uncomfortably like panic.
"There has to be another way," he said. "There is," Michael replied quietly. "We can run the story with just Tommy's documents. It might not bring down the whole network, but it would expose some of the corruption, maybe save some lives. And maybe get us all killed without accomplishing anything meaningful," Elena countered. "These people have had 3 years to adapt, to cover their tracks, to eliminate loose ends. Tommy's evidence is 3 years old. We need current proof that the operation is still active." She moved to the table and pulled out a specific photograph. Henry shaking hands with a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows. This was taken 2 weeks before Tommy died. The man Henry is meeting? That's Detective Captain Morrison, Tommy's supervisor, the man who buried the investigation. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The corruption wasn't just about wealthy clients purchasing murder services. It extended into the very institutions that were supposed to investigate and prosecute such crimes. "Morrison is still active," Elena continued. "He's been promoted twice since Tommy's death. If the cleanup crew is still operating, he's still covering for them. That means there's current evidence to be found." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at Elena with the kind of respect he usually reserved for worthy business adversaries. She'd spent 3 years running from these people, but she'd also spent that time thinking, planning, preparing for the moment when running would no longer be enough. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Elena's smile was fierce and beautiful and absolutely terrifying. "Resources, protection for the people helping us, and a promise that if something happens to me, you'll make sure the story gets told anyway." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Marcus said with more certainty than he felt. "You can't promise that, but you can promise that my death won't be meaningless." Marcus met her gaze and saw his own reflection in her dark eyes. A man who'd built his life on the careful management of risk and reward, now preparing to stake everything on a cause that had nothing to do with profit and everything to do with justice. "I promise," he said. Michael began gathering the documents back into their envelope. "If we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Every day we wait gives them more time to adapt, to eliminate evidence, to eliminate us." "How quickly?" Marcus asked. "Tomorrow morning. Henry's delivery arrives at 6. I can be there to help unload, plant the devices, and be out before the regular staff arrives for lunch prep." James shook his head emphatically. 12 hours isn't enough time to plan an operation this complex. We need surveillance, backup plans, extraction protocols. 12 hours is what we have, Elena said firmly. Henry knows I overheard something last night. He's not stupid. He'll be watching me, looking for signs that I'm more than just a scared waitress. The longer we wait, the more suspicious he becomes. Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had carried him through every major decision of his business career. The moment when careful planning gave way to decisive action, when success or failure hung on the courage to commit fully to a chosen path. "All right," he said, "we do it tomorrow, but we do it right." He turned to James and Parker. "I want a full tactical team in position around the restaurant. Snipers, surveillance, extraction vehicles. If something goes wrong, I want Elena out of there in under 60 seconds. "And if the tactical team is compromised?" Michael asked. "Then we make sure the story gets told anyway," Marcus replied, looking directly at Elena. "Multiple channels, like you said, print, television, online. Make it too big to suppress." Elena nodded, but Marcus could see the fear beneath her determination. She was brave enough to walk back into danger, but she wasn't foolish enough to believe she would definitely walk back out. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "If this goes badly tomorrow, if they realize what we're doing, they won't just come after us. They'll go after anyone connected to us. Your employees, Michael's sources, anyone who might have information they can't afford to leave loose." The weight of responsibility settled over Marcus like a heavy cloak. He'd made decisions that affected thousands of employees before, but never decisions that might literally determine whether those employees lived or died. "Then we make sure it doesn't go badly," he said. But even as he spoke the words, Marcus knew that some things were beyond anyone's control. Tomorrow morning, Elena Martinez, or whoever she really was, would walk back into the place where her husband's killers conducted their business. She would plant devices that could bring down a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and law enforcement. And she would do it, knowing that discovery meant not just her own death, but potentially the deaths of everyone who'd chosen to help her. The city sparkled beyond the conference room windows, beautiful and oblivious to the war that was about to be fought in its shadows. Somewhere out there, Henri was probably planning his next move, calculating how to eliminate the threats that had emerged from what should have been a simple poisoning. But Henri didn't know that his intended victim had survived. He didn't know about Tommy's documents, or Michael's journalistic connections, or the resources that Marcus could bring to bear. Most importantly, he didn't know about the young woman who'd spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, and was now preparing to use that invisibility as a weapon. Marcus looked at Elena one last time before they began the detailed planning that would carry them through the night and into whatever tomorrow would bring. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. Elena's answer came without hesitation. "Tommy died trying to stop these people. The least I can do is finish what he started." The next several hours passed in a blur of tactical planning and equipment procurement. Marcus's security team worked with military precision, mapping the restaurant's layout, identifying sight lines and escape routes, coordinating with Michael's network of media contacts to ensure that whatever evidence they gathered would reach the public regardless of what happened to the people gathering it. Elena sat at the center of it all, her memory of the restaurant's daily routines proving invaluable as they refined their plan. She knew which delivery entrance would be least monitored, which staff members arrived early, and which came in just before the lunch rush, where Henri kept his office and how often he checked the security cameras.
"The devices need to go in 3 locations," she said, marking positions on the restaurant's floor plan. Henry's office, obviously, but also the private dining room where he meets with clients, and somewhere in the kitchen where the staff talk freely. Marcus studied the tiny surveillance devices that his contacts had provided, each no larger than a button, capable of recording high-definition video and crystal-clear audio for up to 72 hours before needing to be retrieved or recharged. How will you get into Henry's office? The cleaning supplies are stored in a closet right next to it. I'll volunteer to help with the morning cleaning routine. It wouldn't be unusual for a waitress to want to earn a few extra dollars. Michael looked up from the laptop where he'd been coordinating with his media contacts. I've got editors standing by at the Washington Post, the Times, and 3 television networks. The moment we have usable footage, it goes out simultaneously. And if we don't get usable footage? Elena asked. Then we run with Tommy's documents and hope for the best, Michael replied honestly. Elena nodded, accepting the risk with the same calm determination she'd shown throughout the planning process. Marcus found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and terror, struck by how someone so young could display such courage in the face of almost certain danger. As dawn approached, the tactical team took their positions around Chez Laurent. Snipers on nearby rooftops, surveillance operatives in vehicles positioned to cover every exit, extraction teams ready to move at the first sign of trouble. Marcus stationed himself in a command center 3 blocks away, watching multiple video feeds that showed the restaurant from every conceivable angle. At exactly 6 a.m., the supply truck arrived at the restaurant's rear entrance. Marcus watched through telephoto lenses as Elena emerged from the shadows, dressed in her waitress uniform and carrying a small bag that contained the surveillance devices. To anyone watching, she looked like exactly what she was supposed to be, a dedicated employee arriving early to help with deliveries and earn a few extra dollars. Henry wasn't there, which was a relief and disappointment. His absence meant Elena could plant the devices without immediate detection, but it also meant they wouldn't capture any incriminating conversations right away. "She's inside," James reported through the tactical radio. "No signs of unusual activity." Marcus gripped the edge of the monitoring console, watching feeds from cameras positioned to cover the restaurant's interior. Elena moved with practiced efficiency, helping the delivery crew unload boxes while discreetly planting the first device in the kitchen area. 20 minutes passed without incident. Elena planted the second device in the private dining room, her movements casual and unremarkable to anyone not specifically watching for suspicious behavior. Then she disappeared from view as she entered the area near Henry's office. "I've lost visual contact," the surveillance operative reported. Marcus felt his heart rate spike but forced himself to remain calm. "How long has she been out of sight?" 3 minutes and counting. Those 3 minutes stretched into an eternity. Marcus found himself holding his breath, straining to hear any sound through the tactical radios that might indicate trouble. In his mind, he ran through every possible scenario. Elena discovered planting the device, Henry arriving unexpectedly, the cleaning crew asking questions she couldn't answer.
"Contact re-established," the operative reported suddenly. "She's exiting through the rear entrance." Marcus watched the feed as Elena emerged from the restaurant, moving with the same unhurried pace she'd maintained throughout the operation. She looked tired, but not panicked, focused, but not frightened. To anyone watching, she'd simply completed an early morning shift and was heading home. "Package delivered," Elena's voice came through the radio. "All 3 presents in place." Marcus felt a surge of relief so intense it left him momentarily lightheaded. She'd done it. The devices were planted, recording everything that happened in the restaurant's most sensitive areas. Whatever conversations took place over the next 72 hours would be captured with high-definition clarity. But as Elena walked away from Chez Laurent, disappearing into the morning foot traffic of delivery workers and early commuters, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. Planting the devices had been dangerous, but retrieving the information they recorded would be even more so. Because Henri would be watching now, alert to any signs that his operation had been compromised. And when the conversations those devices recorded began to reveal the scope of the cleanup crew's activities, the people behind those activities would do everything in their power to ensure the recordings never saw the light of day. The war Elena had declared was only beginning. The first breakthrough came 18 hours after the devices were planted. Marcus was in his office, trying to maintain the appearance of normal business operations while every fiber of his being was focused on the surveillance feeds streaming from Chez Laurent, when Michael Chen burst through the door with an expression of barely contained excitement. "You need to see this," Michael said, connecting his laptop to the conference room's large monitor. The audio from Henri's office picked up a phone conversation that changes everything. Marcus gathered his security team around the monitor as Michael played the recording. Henri's voice came through with crystal clarity, speaking in the kind of casual tone someone might use to discuss restaurant reservations rather than contract murder. "Yes, the Blackwood situation has been handled. Natural causes, just as requested. The client was very satisfied with the discretion shown." Another voice, distorted through the phone's speaker but still audible, responded. "Excellent. And the Martinez problem?" "More complicated. She's proven surprisingly resourceful at staying hidden. But my people have located her current position. It's just a matter of choosing the right moment." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. They were talking about Elena as if she were already dead, discussing the logistics of her murder with the same professional detachment a businessman might use to plan a product launch.
The conversation ended, leaving the room in stunned silence. The recordings weren't just evidence of ongoing criminal activity. They were active threats against specific, identifiable people. "They think you're dead," Elena said quietly. She'd been sitting in the corner, listening to the recording with the focused intensity of someone hearing her own death sentence being planned. Marcus nodded grimly. "Which gives us a temporary advantage, but not for long." James stepped forward from his position by the door. "Sir, with respect, this changes our timeline considerably. If they're planning to move against Miss Martinez within 48 hours, we need to act immediately." "Agreed," Michael said, "but we also need more evidence. One phone conversation isn't enough to bring down a network this size." As if summoned by his words, Parker entered the room carrying a tablet loaded with additional surveillance footage. "The private dining room camera captured something you need to see," he said, connecting the device to the monitor. The screen filled with high-definition video of the restaurant's most exclusive dining area. Around an elegant table sat 5 people Marcus recognized with a mixture of shock and growing rage. Judge Harrison Caldwell, Senator Patricia Voss, Police Captain Morrison, and 2 others he didn't immediately identify. This was recorded last night, about 3 hours after the devices were planted. The video showed Henri entering the dining room carrying a leather portfolio, which he placed on the table with ceremonial precision. "The monthly reports," Henri announced to the assembled group. "As you can see, our operational efficiency remains quite high." Judge Caldwell opened the portfolio and began reading from what appeared to be a detailed accounting of the cleanup crew's activities, names, dates, methods of elimination, payments received. It was a business report for a murder-for-hire operation, delivered with the same professional polish Marcus had seen in countless corporate boardrooms. "The Blackwood matter was resolved with our standard cardiac protocol. Client satisfaction was rated as excellent, and payment was processed through the usual channels." Senator Voss looked up from the documents. "What about the Martinez woman?
She's been a persistent loose end for too long. Active elimination is scheduled within 36 hours. We've identified her current location and employment. The method will be staged to appear as a random street crime, very common in her neighborhood. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge as Elena's face went pale beside him. They were discussing her murder with the casual efficiency of people planning a dinner party. Captain Morrison leaned back in his chair. And the journalist problem? Chen is being handled as we speak. Traffic accident, already in progress. By morning, he'll be another unfortunate statistic. Michael grabbed his phone immediately, dialing a number with shaking fingers. Jenny, it's Michael. Where are you right now? Okay, listen to me very carefully. Do not get in your car. Do not walk anywhere alone. Get to the nearest police station and stay there until I come to get you. He hung up and turned to Marcus. My research assistant. She's been helping me investigate Tommy's case. If they think I'm the one asking questions...
She's safe, Marcus said firmly. James, I want protection details assigned to everyone in Michael's network immediately. And Elena? I'm not hiding anymore, Elena interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. They're going to kill me anyway. At least this way, my death can mean something. The video continued playing, revealing detail after detail of an operation that had been eliminating problems for the wealthy and powerful for at least 3 years. Financial records showing payments in the millions, photographs of completed assignments, even testimonials from satisfied clients praising the crew's professionalism and discretion. This is enough, Michael said, his journalist's instincts overriding his personal fear. This is more than enough to bring down everyone in that room. But as he spoke, Henri's voice from the recording delivered a revelation that changed everything. The architect sends his compliments on your continued discretion, Henri said to the assembled group. He particularly appreciates the way you've maintained operational security during the recent expansion into federal contracts. Federal contracts? The cleanup crew wasn't just serving local wealthy clients. They were working for the federal government, eliminating problems that traditional legal channels couldn't handle. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. They're not just criminals. They're contractors. Elena stood slowly, her face reflecting a mixture of horror and grim understanding. That's why Tommy's investigation got shut down so quickly. That's why no one would touch the case. It wasn't just corruption. It was national security. The implications were staggering. If the cleanup crew was operating under some form of government sanction, then exposing them might require more than just media coverage. It might require congressional hearings, federal investigations, the kind of political earthquake that could bring down administrations. We need to contact the FBI, James said. No, Elena replied immediately. Tommy tried that. Look how that worked out. Michael was already working his phone, sending encrypted messages throughout his network. We go public simultaneously across multiple platforms, make it impossible to suppress or discredit. But even as he coordinated the media blitz that would expose the cleanup crew, Marcus found himself thinking about the timeline Henri had mentioned. 36 hours to eliminate Elena. By morning, Michael was supposed to be dead in a traffic accident. The window for action was closing rapidly, and their enemies were already in motion. We need to disappear, Marcus said suddenly. All of us, right now. Elena shook her head. Running won't solve anything. They'll just wait us out, then eliminate us one by one when we surface. Then what do you suggest? Elena's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. We give them what they want, but not the way they expect. She moved to the conference table and began spreading out Tommy's original documents alongside the new recordings and video footage. They want to eliminate loose ends. Fine. Let's make sure the biggest loose end of all is too public to eliminate.
Marcus felt a familiar surge of admiration for Elena's strategic thinking. She'd learned from 3 years of being hunted, and now she was ready to turn those lessons against her hunters. What did you have in mind?
"A press conference," Elena said simply. "Tomorrow morning, full media coverage, streaming online, broadcasts live. I tell Tommy's story, we release the evidence, and we make ourselves too visible to kill quietly." Michael looked up from his phone. "It could work. If the story is already public, eliminating the sources becomes counterproductive." "It's also incredibly dangerous," James pointed out. "You'd be painting a target on yourself that would be visible from space." "I already have that target," Elena replied. "The difference is, this way, I get to aim back." Marcus found himself faced with the same kind of decision that had defined his entire business career, a moment when careful analysis had to give way to decisive action, when success depended on the courage to commit fully to a chosen path. But this time, the stakes weren't measured in dollars and market share. They were measured in lives, in justice, in the fundamental question of whether people with enough money and power could literally get away with murder. "All right. We hold a press conference, but we do it right, with enough security to ensure you live long enough to tell your story." Elena nodded, but Marcus could see the fear beneath her determination. She knew that stepping into the spotlight would make her a target not just for Henri and his crew, but for everyone whose secrets would be exposed by Tommy's investigation. Tomorrow morning, Elena Martinez would stop running and start fighting back. The question was whether she would survive long enough to win. The final recordings from Chez Laurent arrived just after midnight, and they contained revelations that made everything they'd already discovered seem like a prelude to a much larger and more terrifying symphony. Marcus was in his office's secure conference room with Elena, Michael, and his security team when Parker connected the latest surveillance data to the main monitor. What they saw on screen was Henri's office, but now it was filled with people whose faces appeared regularly on national news broadcasts. "Congressional leadership," Michael whispered, recognizing figures from both political parties. "This isn't just local corruption anymore." The conversation that followed laid out the scope of an operation that reached into every level of government. The cleanup crew hadn't just been eliminating problems for wealthy individuals. They'd been providing services to federal agencies, congressional committees, and political organizations across the spectrum. "Operation Clean Slate," one of the congressmen was saying, "has been remarkably successful in resolving long-term complications." Henri nodded deferentially. "The architect's protocols have proven adaptable to a wide range of situations. Whistleblowers, investigative journalists, inconvenient witnesses, all handled with complete discretion." Elena gripped the arms of her chair as the full scope of what had killed her husband became clear. Tommy hadn't stumbled onto a local corruption ring. He'd uncovered a national shadow operation that eliminated inconvenient truths for anyone with the authorization to make the request. "How many?" she asked quietly. On screen, Henri was consulting a tablet. In the past 3 years, approximately 230 successful resolutions, success rate of 94%, with client satisfaction consistently rated as excellent. 230 people, dead because they'd known something, seen something, or represented some form of threat to people in power. Tommy had been just one name on a list that stretched across the entire country. Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest, not just at the scope of the operation, but at the casual way these people discussed murder as if it were a form of customer service. "The press conference is tomorrow morning," he said, his voice steady despite the rage beneath it. "But first, we make sure every piece of this evidence is preserved and distributed so widely that it can't be suppressed." Michael was already working, uploading files to secure servers around the world, sending encrypted copies to journalists and human rights organizations, ensuring that even if they didn't survive the night, the truth would. "There's something else," Elena said, pointing to a detail on the screen that had escaped their attention. On Henri's desk sat a familiar object, the same manila envelope that had contained Tommy's original investigation. "They have the files, the ones Tommy hid. They found them." The implication was clear. The cleanup crew knew exactly what evidence existed against them, and they'd been planning their responses accordingly. The press conference they were planning wouldn't be a surprise attack. It would be walking into a trap whose dimensions they were only beginning to understand. But Elena's response surprised Marcus. Instead of fear, he saw calculation in her dark eyes. "Good," she said simply. "Good? If they have Tommy's files, then they think they know everything we know. But they don't know about the surveillance devices. They don't know we've been recording their meetings for the past day and a half." Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Elena's strategic thinking. She'd spent 3 years learning to think like her enemies, and now she was using that knowledge against them. "We let them think they're in control," Elena continued. "We hold the press conference as planned, but we don't reveal the recordings until the last possible moment. Let them make their moves based on incomplete information." The next several hours passed in careful preparation. Marcus coordinated with media outlets to ensure maximum coverage, while his security team planned protection protocols that would keep Elena alive long enough to tell her story. Michael worked with his network of journalists to create multiple backup plans for releasing the evidence if the primary press conference was disrupted. And Elena sat quietly in the center of it all, preparing to step out of the shadows she had inhabited for 3 years and into a spotlight that would make her the most visible target in the country. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked her as dawn approached. Elena's smile was sad and fierce, and absolutely beautiful. "I've been ready for 3 years. The only question was whether I'd ever get the chance." As the city awakened around them, beginning another day in blissful ignorance of the war being fought in its shadows, Elena Martinez prepared to honor her dead husband's memory by finishing the work that had cost him his life. Tomorrow morning, the widow of Detective Tommy Vasquez would step before the cameras and tell the world about Operation Clean Slate, about Henri and his crew of professional killers, about the network of corruption that reached from local restaurants to the highest levels of government. She would do it knowing that survival was unlikely, but that silence was no longer an option. The reckoning Tommy had died seeking was finally at hand.
The press conference began at 9 a.m. sharp, with Elena standing before a wall of cameras and microphones that would broadcast her words around the world. Marcus stood beside her, his presence both protective and symbolic. The millionaire who'd chosen justice over safety. The businessman who'd risked everything to stand with a waitress seeking truth. 3 years ago, my husband, Detective Tommy Vasquez, was murdered for investigating what he called the cleanup crew, Elena began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Today, I'm finishing his work. The evidence poured forth in devastating detail. Tommy's original documents, the surveillance recordings from Chez Laurent, the video footage of government officials planning murders with casual efficiency. Names, faces, financial records, an entire shadow operation exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny. Andre and his crew were arrested within hours. Captain Morrison was found dead in his office, an apparent suicide that fooled no one. The congressional leaders scrambled for cover as federal prosecutors launched investigations that would topple governments and reshape the balance of power in Washington. Elena survived. Against all odds, against the threats and the fear and the 3 years of running, she survived to see justice done. The cleanup crew that had eliminated 230 people was itself eliminated, not by bullets or poison, but by the most powerful weapon of all, the truth, told by a woman brave enough to step out of the shadows. Marcus kept his promise. Elena's death hadn't been necessary after all, but her courage had been everything. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.